The lightning split the Texas sky like a jagged scar, and Sarah Mitchell knew this storm would be different. Standing on the porch of her isolated ranch house, she watched the clouds rolling in like dark fists, ready to pummel everything in their path. Most people would have retreated inside, locked their doors, and waited it out. But Sarah had learned long ago that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is nothing at all. She was about to turn back inside when she saw it, a dark shape stumbling along the muddy road that led past her property. At first, she thought it might be a wounded animal, but as another flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, she realized it was a man. He was limping badly, clutching his side, and even from a distance, she could see he was in serious trouble. Sarah's late husband had always told her to be careful about strangers, especially out here where help was miles away and neighbors were few. But he'd also taught her something more important, that turning away from someone in need wasn't living, it was just existing. Without a second thought, she grabbed her raincoat and ran into the storm. The man collapsed just as she reached him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what had once been nice clothes now torn and covered in blood and mud. His cowboy hat lay a few feet away, trampled and forgotten. Up close, she could see he was younger than she'd thought, maybe in his early 30s, with a strong jawline and dark hair plastered to his forehead. His eyes flickered open for just a moment, startling green eyes filled with pain and something else. Fear. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the thunder. "They're coming. You need to get away from me." But Sarah Mitchell had been a nurse before she'd become a rancher's wife, and she recognized a life-or-death situation when she saw one. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, hooking her arm under his shoulder. "And neither are you, except into my house." Getting him inside was like dragging a fallen tree, but somehow she managed. By the time she'd laid him on her kitchen table, the only surface big enough, she was soaking wet and breathing hard. That's when she saw the wound properly. A bullet had grazed his ribs, and though it wasn't immediately fatal, he'd lost a lot of blood. As she worked to clean and bandage the wound, her hands moving with the muscle memory of her nursing days, she noticed other things. His hands were calloused but well kept. He wore an expensive watch. And when she'd pulled his wallet from his pocket to check for medical information, she'd found no identification at all, just a substantial amount of cash and a photograph of a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, with the same green eyes. "Who is she?" Sarah asked softly, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. His eyes opened again, focusing on her with surprising clarity. "My daughter," he managed. "Emma. They took her. I was trying to get her back when." His face contorted with pain that seemed to go deeper than the physical wound. Sarah's heart clenched. She had no children of her own, it was one of the great sorrows of her life, but she understood instantly that this man would do anything for his little girl. "What's your name?" she asked, threading a needle to stitch the deepest part of the wound. "Jake," he said through gritted teeth. "Jake Coleman. And ma'am, I'm real sorry to bring trouble to your door, but I think you just saved my life." Jake slept for 16 hours straight, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion and blood loss. Sarah kept watch, checking his pulse and temperature, changing his bandages, and wondering what exactly she'd gotten herself into. She'd called Sheriff Morrison, an old friend, but he'd been dealing with flooding on the east side of the county and couldn't get to her until the roads cleared. That left her alone with a wounded stranger and a growing certainty that his story involved more than a simple accident. When Jake finally woke, it was late afternoon, and golden sunlight was streaming through the kitchen windows. He sat up carefully, testing his injury, then looked at her with those impossibly green eyes. "You're still here," he said, and she couldn't tell if he was relieved or worried. "This is my house," Sarah replied with a slight smile, setting down a cup of coffee she'd been nursing. "Where else would I be?" "Away from me," Jake said seriously. "Ma'am, Sarah, I meant what I said. There are dangerous people looking for me, and if they find me here." "Then tell me what's really going on," she interrupted, sitting down across from him. "You're clearly not a criminal." That watch you're wearing costs more than my truck. You're educated, I can hear it in your voice. And you're desperate about your daughter. So who took her, and why? Jake was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with how much to tell her. Finally, he sighed. I'm a federal prosecutor in Houston. 3 months ago, I was assigned to a case involving a major drug trafficking operation with ties to corrupt law enforcement. The kind of case that makes careers, or ends lives. I thought Emma was safe. My ex-wife has custody, and I thought. His voice broke. They took her 2 days ago. Sent me a message that if I didn't destroy the evidence and disappear, I'd never see her again. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. So you tried to rescue her yourself? I had to try, Jake said desperately. I got close, so close I could see her through a window at their compound. But they were ready for me. I barely got away. He looked down at his bandaged side. Obviously. And now? Now I need to heal up enough to try again. But I won't put you in danger, Sarah. As soon as I can walk properly, I'll leave. I promise. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at her land. 5 years ago, she'd lost her husband to cancer, watching him slip away despite all her nursing skills, despite all her prayers. She'd promised herself then that she would never again stand by helplessly while someone she cared about was in danger. And though she barely knew this man, she recognized something in him, the same fierce determination to protect the people you love that her husband had shown until his very last breath. No, she said, turning back to Jake. You're not leaving. Not yet. And when you do go after your daughter, you're not going alone. Jake started to protest, but she held up her hand. Listen to me, Jake Coleman. I was a trauma nurse for 15 years. I can shoot a rifle better than most men in this county, and I know every back road and hiding place within 50 miles. You need help, whether you want to admit it or not. Why would you do this? Jake asked, genuine confusion in his voice. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Sarah thought about that for a moment. My husband and I tried for 10 years to have children, she said quietly. It never happened. But I still remember what it felt like to dream about holding my own child, protecting them, watching them grow. I see that same love in your eyes when you talk about Emma. How could I not help? Jake's eyes glistened with emotion. He stood up slowly, wincing slightly, and extended his hand. When Sarah took it, his grip was firm and warm. Then I promise you this, he said solemnly. I will protect you with everything I have. And when this is over, if we both make it through, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on a bleeding stranger in a storm. Neither of them could have known then how deeply that promise would come to mean, or how dramatically their lives were about to change. Over the next 3 days, Jake healed with remarkable speed, and Sarah saw what kind of man he really was. He insisted on helping around the ranch despite his injury, refusing to be a burden. He fixed the broken fence post she'd been meaning to repair for months. He organized her chaotic barn. And in the evenings, they sat on the porch and planned. Jake had memorized the layout of the compound where Emma was being held, a former ranch property about 40 miles away that belonged to Marcus Vega, the head of the trafficking operation. He drew maps, marked guard positions, and outlined a dozen different approaches, each one more dangerous than the last. We need help, Sarah finally said on the third night. Professional help. What about the FBI? Surely they have protocols for this kind of situation. Jake's face darkened. Marcus has people inside law enforcement. That's how he knew about my investigation, how he knew about Emma. I can't risk it. One wrong move, one person who's on his payroll, and she's dead. Sarah understood his fear, but she also recognized something else in his reluctance, pride. The kind of pride that came from being a man who solved problems, who protected people, who never asked for help. It was the same pride her husband had shown when he'd refused to admit how much pain he was in during those final months. "Jake," she said gently, "you can't save her by yourself. You almost died trying. Now you're asking me to risk my life too, which I'm willing to do, but don't we owe it to Emma to have the best possible chance of success?" He looked at her, and she saw the moment when his walls cracked. "I'm terrified," he admitted, his voice raw. "Every minute that passes is another minute she's scared and alone. What if they're hurting her? What if?" Sarah reached out and took his hand. "Emma is strong because you're her father. She's holding on because she knows you're coming. But we need to be smart about this." That's when Jake told her about David Chen, his former partner at the prosecutor's office who'd left to join the FBI. "He's the only one I'd trust," Jake said. "But I don't know if he'd risk his career to help me with an unauthorized rescue operation." "Call him," Sarah said simply. "You might be surprised." Jake made the call that night, and David Chen arrived the next morning, bringing with him 2 other agents he'd trust with his life. Sarah watched the reunion, the fierce hug, the unspoken understanding between men who'd been through battles together, and felt something unexpected. A pang of loneliness. Not just for her late husband, but for this kind of connection, this depth of loyalty and care. But there was no time for dwelling on feelings. David had used his FBI resources to gather more intelligence. The situation was worse than they'd thought. Marcus Vega was planning to move Emma in 48 hours, taking her out of the country as leverage against not just Jake, but several other prosecutors and law enforcement officials who'd gotten too close to his operation. "We have to move tomorrow night," David said grimly. "It's our only window." They spent the next day preparing. David's team brought equipment, weapons, and body armor. They ran through the plan a dozen times, adjusting for every contingency they could think of. And through it all, Sarah noticed how Jake kept glancing at her, as if making sure she was still there, still committed. That evening, as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Jake found Sarah in the barn, checking her rifle one last time. "You can still back out," he said quietly. "This isn't your fight." Sarah looked up at him, this man who'd stumbled into her life just days ago but who'd somehow become important in ways she couldn't quite explain. "Isn't it?" she asked. "The moment I pulled you out of that storm, it became my fight too. Besides," she added with a small smile, "someone needs to watch your back tomorrow night. You federal prosecutors aren't exactly known for your tactical skills." Jake laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd heard from him, and the sound warmed her more than she wanted to admit. Then his expression turned serious. "Sarah, if something happens to me tomorrow, promise me you'll—" "Nothing's going to happen to you," she interrupted firmly. "Because I won't let it. We're getting Emma back, Jake. All of us are coming home." He stepped closer, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might kiss her. Instead, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. "You're the bravest person I've ever met," he said softly. "And I don't know what I did to deserve stumbling onto your property, but I'll thank God for it every day for the rest of my life." The compound was exactly as Jake had described, a sprawling ranch house surrounded by outbuildings, with guards posted at regular intervals. Sarah's heart pounded as they approached under cover of darkness, David's team moving with military precision while she and Jake followed close behind. The plan was simple in theory, impossibly complex in execution. David's team would create a diversion at the front gate while Jake and Sarah slipped in through a weak point in the back fence. They had 12 minutes to get to the room where Emma was being held, get her out, and reach the extraction point where David would be waiting. Everything went wrong almost immediately. The fence had been reinforced since Jake's last reconnaissance. The guard rotation had changed, putting 2 men exactly where they needed to go. And worst of all, Marcus Vega himself was at the compound, something intelligence had said wouldn't happen. But they'd come too far to turn back. Sarah watched as Jake took down the first guard with silent efficiency, then helped her through the window of what looked like a storage building. From there, they navigated through a maze of corridors, Jake moving on instinct and memory, Sarah covering their rear with her rifle. They were almost to Emma's room when they heard a little girl scream. Jake ran, all caution abandoned, and Sarah sprinted after him. He kicked open a door to find Emma backed into a corner, crying, while Marcus Vega stood over her with a weapon. The drug lord turned, bringing his gun up to fire at Jake. Sarah didn't think. She just moved. Years of muscle memory from her hunting days took over, and she fired first. The bullet struck Marcus in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. "Daddy!" Emma sobbed, and Jake rushed to her, scooping her up in his arms and holding her so tightly Sarah thought he might never let go. The little girl buried her face in her father's shoulder, her small body shaking with relief and exhaustion. "We need to move," Sarah said urgently, keeping her rifle trained on Marcus, who was clutching his wounded shoulder and glaring at them with pure hatred. David's team will have heard that shot. They ran, Jake carrying Emma, Sarah covering them, and somehow, through luck, skill, and maybe a little divine intervention, they made it to the extraction point. David's team had successfully neutralized most of the guards, and within minutes, they were speeding away into the darkness, sirens wailing in the distance as local law enforcement, the ones David trusted, moved in to secure the compound. In the back of the SUV, Emma refused to let go of Jake. She clung to him like a barnacle, and he held her just as fiercely, tears streaming down his face. Sarah sat across from them, her adrenaline slowly fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and an overwhelming sense of relief. "Thank you," Emma suddenly said, looking up at Sarah with those same green eyes. "Are you an angel?" "Daddy said angels protect people." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "No, sweetheart. I'm just someone who cares about your daddy." Jake looked at her over Emma's head, and the expression on his face made Sarah's heart skip. It was gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. Something that looked a lot like love. The days that followed were a blur of official statements, debriefings, and media attention once the story broke. Marcus Vega's entire operation collapsed as FBI agents arrested dozens of traffickers and corrupt officials. Jake's evidence, combined with what they found at the compound, ensured that the people who terrorized his daughter would spend the rest of their lives in prison. Through it all, Jake and Emma stayed at Sarah's ranch. At first, it was just practical, they needed somewhere safe while the investigation concluded. But as days turned into weeks, it became something more. Emma helped Sarah feed the chickens every morning, her laughter filling spaces that had been silent for too long. Jake fixed everything on the property that had broken over the years of Sarah managing alone, and in the evenings, the three of them sat on the porch and watched the sunset together. One night, after Emma had gone to bed, Jake finally said what had been building between them since that first storm-tossed night. "I promised to protect you," he said, taking Sarah's hand. "But the truth is, you're the one who saved me. Not just my life, but something I thought I'd lost, the ability to trust, to hope, to believe that good people still exist in this world." "Jake," Sarah began, but he gently pressed a finger to her lips. "Let me finish," he said with a soft smile. "I also promised that if we made it through, I'd spend the rest of my life making sure you never regretted helping me. But somewhere along the way, that promise changed. Now I want to spend the rest of my life not because of a debt, but because I can't imagine being anywhere else. Because I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I love your strength, your courage, your kindness. I love the way you make Emma laugh, and the way you look at sunrise over your land. I love." Sarah kissed him, stopping the flow of words because sometimes actions speak louder. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless, she said, "I love you too. And I love that little girl in there who calls me Miss Sarah and asks me a million questions about everything. I love the life we're building together. I love." Now it was Jake's turn to stop her words with a kiss. 6 months later, Sarah stood on that same porch in a simple white dress, with Emma as her flower girl and what seemed like half the county in attendance. As Jake slipped a ring onto her finger and promised to love her for the rest of his days, Sarah thought about that stormy night when a bleeding stranger had stumbled onto her property. She'd thought she was saving his life, but the truth was so much more beautiful. They'd saved each other. Jake had given her a family, a purpose, and a love she'd thought she'd never experience. She'd given him trust, safety, and a place to call home. And together, they'd given Emma something every child deserves, a house full of love and laughter, with two parents who would protect her and each other against anything the world might throw at them. Sometimes, Sarah reflected as Jake kissed her amid the cheers of their friends and family, the bravest thing you can do is open your door to a stranger in a storm. Because you never know, that stranger might just be the missing piece of your heart that you never even knew was gone. And sometimes, the cowboy who promises to protect you ends up being the one who teaches you that the strongest protection isn't about weapons or walls, it's about two hearts choosing, every single day, to be vulnerable and brave together. That's the real happily ever after, not the absence of storms, but the presence of someone who'll stand beside you in the rain, holding your hand, and refusing to let go.